My name is Chris Thursten. I'm here to talk to you, now that the microphone is on, about how we've approached storytelling in Hackmud, which is an indie MMO where players become hackers in a text-based version of the internet of the future. And as I have done for every talk I've ever prepared or written or done, I had to submit one title very early because that's how it works. And then about yesterday-ish, I realized I'd much rather the talk be called this. This doesn't work, which is a good thing to discover right now. Excuse me one moment. There we go. Good. That's the key to comic timing, is timing. And anyway, shall we continue? Before I continue talking about the game and storytelling specifically, I want to provide some credits and a kind of an overview of the game itself, because I anticipate that not everyone will have played it. Hackmud is a game by Sean Mann. Lena Raine did music. Benjamin Johns did a lot of the initial writing. Jess Floyd did the art, and Ryan Ike did some more music for our 2.0 update. And I came in about 6 months after launch. The game came out about 2 years ago. Rock Paper Shotgun very kindly gave us MMO of the Year in 2016, and Giant Bomb called us the best fake computer of 2016, which is a competitive field. So what sets Hackmud apart as a hacking game specifically is the fact that while we do have puzzles and abstract elements, many of the skills that players are required to learn in the game are pretty analogous to real hacking, and I mean this in opposed to mini-games, for example. So hacking in Hackmud basically just means doing whatever it takes to get into a locked system. That might mean solving a puzzle, which we have plenty of, or it might mean winning a game in our command line strategy system, which is called binary matrix. Or it might mean infiltrating a rival corporation and lying to them until they give you their stuff. Or it might mean simply tricking another player into running a dodgy script that you've written. This is all hacking at the end of the day, because all it means is getting the answer you want, and that'll kind of become important for other reasons. Writing, this is what the game looks like, by the way. Writing scripts, specifically, is a really big part of the game for a lot of players. If you understand JavaScript, then you're off to the races in quite a big way in Hackmud. And if you don't understand JavaScript, then it's actually a really good way to learn. It's taught me a lot about how to code, and I came to it as a writer, famously unable to do so. After you've cracked a few accounts, for example, the old-fashioned way by solving puzzles, etc., you'll probably want to write a script that does that for you, that takes that aspect of the game and automates it. But then the kind of expanding brain version of this is to go on and write a script that could do it for anybody, that you can give to any player, but takes a bit of their money when they do it. And then the stage beyond that is inventing banking, which players have already done, so good luck, you'd have to make a better bank. So before I want to get on to talking about storytelling, I want to establish that these elements, this game about scripting and stealing and free-form creativity within what genuinely is a very open sandbox, is Hackmud for most of our community. The story of the game, as it's experienced holistically, I guess, stems from things players come up with in the sandbox that the game provides. They've even created their own narrative adventures, because there is nothing stopping you within this framework from creating a text adventure, for example, and they do. So that provides a dimension that is entirely separate from the kind of narrative stuff that I want to talk about. Even so, this sandbox, and this very specific sandbox, provides an opportunity to experiment with approaches to multiplayer storytelling, particularly because the game takes place in a digital environment. I'll get to some of the specifics, but the game takes place within a computer system. As a result, information, storytelling, data, whatever form that takes, is both a commodity and it is the narrative. And we'll get to the ways we can kind of manipulate this in a bit. And it's also provided a pretty unique community that receives stories in a really particular way. This is a community that is primed to sort of programmatically take apart any system they find of any kind, and who have plenty of tools to break apart any mystery you throw at them. And that, in itself, is a really interesting challenge when it comes to storytelling. So Hackmud is set in the abandoned internet of the future, a world where all of the humans have vanished, leaving various digital assistants to fend for themselves. And these range from AI powering vacuum cleaners, to drones, to weather services, to much more sophisticated sentiences that operate at a higher strata within the network. And I appreciate that if there are Hackmud players watching on the live stream or in the room, they might be worried that might be about to spoil stuff. I'm not. This will be spoiler-free, and please don't treat me and the things I say as clues, because they're not. Players encounter this world first through a single-player tutorial, and then they enter a multiplayer sandbox. And if at that point they choose to never ask any further questions about the nature of this digital environment, then that's absolutely fine. They can spend their entire life understanding it at this top level. And the analogy I would use here is you can play Destiny for as long as you like and simply treat it as a shooter and never dig any deeper into any of the things that writing team might be trying to do behind the scenes, for example. Even so, there is a sense of mystery at the heart of the game. So if we describe that as kind of the top level, this is everyday play, the kinds of things people encounter. Despite this, there is a sense of mystery that underpins the game. What happened to all the people? Where did they go? And this gives it a sense of weight. Essentially takes the form of a question, but where did all the people go? And when I started working on the game, this is one of the elements that I really wanted to expand. Because particularly in an MMO, a good fundamental mystery can be a really great thing. It gives players something that they can legitimately discover and share with each other and take some ownership over. And it also makes the world feel like it has both a past, because there's something has happened, and also a future, because it provides a sense of where things might go next. And this is something that you've probably encountered if you've played Destiny for any length of time, or World of Warcraft, or any game that really makes use of the things you happen to notice are wrong or strange as you move around going about your business every day in the game. The challenge here, however, from a narrative design point of view, is turning that sense of mystery into a fleshed out and fair mystery. And I lean on the word fair mystery very carefully because I watched Lost. And I watched Lost from episode 1 until the day when I got up at 4 in the morning to watch the season finale. And I don't want to talk about it. But it has shaped my attitude towards setting up what is fundamentally a what happened here type story in every context from now on. And so when I talk about setting up a story that feels fair, what I mean is establishing answers to some fundamental questions that hopefully support, reflect, enhance, or give a different, say something about the nature of the game as it is experienced by players, not simply a story bolted to the whole. Also, they have to have defined parameters underpinned by logic that can ultimately be discovered. There has to really genuinely be an answer on the other end of the rainbow, which resolves the game into something a little closer to that, where you end up with a foundation at the bottom of the game, which is made up of answers supported by logic, which really is made up of my Google Drive, and maybe not encountered directly by players ever, but it gives us a destination to get to with all this big blank space in the middle, which is why I've laid this slide out in this otherwise unintuitive way. Then what we did was start to allow this logic that took some time to kind of pull together to power narrative puzzle events. And this is a side of the game that is sort of partly takes the form of what a raid might look like in a text-based hacking game. It's also a way to bring the community together. And it's also a big influence on it was sort of ARGs and the way that sort of one-off moments where people feel like they were working together to solve a problem really pulls the community together. So what we did was throw an event at the players that does some of the initial work of providing some traction on that core mystery. Not revealing a lot, but providing enough to start getting players thinking about what might be happening and giving them some of the right verbs to start thinking about in terms of what the answers might ultimately be. And the really crucial thing here is that discussion step. Because the talking part of a mystery, whether that takes the form of something happening in a game or a mystery TV show that people discuss every day, is actually fundamentally kind of the best bit, the water cooler moment. This is the fan theory, the Reddit browsing side of watching Game of Thrones, whatever form that takes for you. And Hackmud is already a game that takes place just as much in people's JavaScript editors and in Discord as it does in the game client. So I really see no problem in considering the ruminations that happen outside the game and the discussions that players have as part of the game itself. And I want to throw something up that will mean maybe nothing to some people. Oh, I did a slide I'd forgotten. This is the stage where the narrative events kick in, by the way. It's this. This is a diagram done by a member of our community that I don't necessarily expect to mean much to anybody in this room. This is a way of conceptualizing the relationship between AI within the system. I'm not going to say whether this is correct or not. What I find really interesting about this is I understand exactly what this person means when they draw this in Paint. And I understand exactly the ways in which it is both correct, maybe, and maybe there's some things I would do differently if I was to try and conceptualize things in this way. I don't say this to illustrate, like, here's a story, so much to say as, here's someone engaging with a story and trying to communicate it and find ways to communicate it with other people in order to kind of arrive at a collective sense of what the F is going on. Encouraging these kinds of conversations, I guess, is super easy. All you need to do is put a locked box in a game and people will discuss what might be in it. That part you can do very, very straightforwardly. It's as simple as having an ambiguity. Harder, I think, and more worthy of kind of unpacking from a narrative design point of view, is how you sustain that discussion and how you make it kind of work with the community over time. And that involves basically trying to create systems that drip feed this kind of mystery to people, that work in addition to maybe like a big event that acts as a season finale where we pull everything together and go nuts with it. So what I want to talk about next is how we go about trying to build gameplay around this process of discovering stuff together and interpreting it, which is kind of our definition of telling stories in a multiplayer context specifically. And it started, our approach at least, with solving a very different set of problems. In Hackmud, as I've said, users create scripts to do almost everything. And in the middle of last year, when I'd been writing for the game for a couple of months, the system was beginning to get flooded with player-made scripts, and it was getting a little bit harder for new players to discover the best, the useful ones. This is like what we call a quality of life issue. It's at this point that that first narrative event kicked in, and as part of it, players broke into a management script for one of the game's ruling AI, a script called Trust, and activated a process that gave it the ability to let scripts die, which is a very significant concept, both from a lore perspective, but also basically from a gameplay one. In game terms, this means that if a script isn't used and isn't popular for a long time, it gets sort of shuffled out of sight and then ultimately kind of decomposes and passes away to wherever scripts go to when they die. It was at this point that we also introduced a new system to the game, kind of secretly. Traditionally in Hackmud, corrupt scripts manifest errors in the forms of like random ASCII kind of characters and garbage, basically. When a user script decays, however, something about that process causes the corruption to start pulling random characters from a completely different set of data entirely. As the file system breaks down, it reveals tiny little glimpses at a set of information that lies beyond the kinds of things that players are dealing with every day. And this corruption, this data from somewhere else, draws from emails, chat logs, and so on, that feature a set of significant characters whose role in the game is only kind of felt or intuited elsewhere. The twist is that the players receive these documents only a few characters at a time via errors in other scripts. So this is an example. So I want to pack this slightly. I have to lean slightly. So this is one script that is in the process of decay being run over and over and over again. As you can see, it's a coin flip, a simple coin flip game. But if you start to go through every line, basically you can see that things go wrong, like the word flip gets corrupted by a different word, something jumps in, the word and kind of appears out of nowhere. There's suddenly the word coin has become the word coat because of the appearance of maybe just a T and a space and another part of a different letter from a different word. Appreciate this looks very, very, very opaque, but I'll get to why this is hopefully neat. What they have to do, the players in this context, is identify which parts are errors, take them out, treat them as pieces, and then ultimately assemble them into documents. And it sounds intimidating. If you haven't played Hackmud, if you have played Hackmud, you'll know that this is as difficult as we needed to make it to pose a threat to a lot of players all working together. When I say pose a threat, I mean provide a fun challenge. So in the first instance, think of this system as being a little bit like archaeology. Players find lots of little bits and pieces and have to figure out what they are. Are these chips of pottery or fragments of dinosaur bones? And given enough time and enough work and enough players, they'll eventually build the vase or assemble the skeleton. And in Hackmud, that ends up looking something like this, which is a script by one of our prominent users, DTR, which lays out some of these hidden documents for anyone to read. So think of this script as a player-made museum. The block of text at the top is the assembled raw data made out of those fragments you just saw. And below, they've gone to the extent of providing a better formatting to let people read it, etc. A lot of player energy goes into arriving at this point. They've gone digging for pieces and written scripts to go hunting for them. They've pooled their findings to arrive at logical interpretations of each document. And because this is the Hackmud community, they've developed programmatic solutions that go hunting for pieces and reassemble text within certain margins of error, which leaves the players free to debate specific details. Here's the fun thing, though. They, like countless archaeologists and historians ever, can make mistakes. And I have to be really careful about what I say here. But for example, sometimes dinosaurs turn out to have feathers, but Jurassic Park has already been made, so no one's mind is ever going to change. And this is exactly the result we were hoping for when we designed the system and when I started writing these documents. And I'll explain why. Because these mechanics are not just designed to be hard to pull together, they're designed to push players out of the relative comfort of a programmatic solution, by which I mean a machine or a script that always gets it right and always solves the puzzle. And it's encouraged to push the players into a different set of skills completely, basically critical reading, bilateral thinking, and most importantly, seeking other perspectives and working together to arrive at a logical interpretation of the data. So in a game that otherwise is quite heavy on engineering and programming and that kind of thing, this is an area where arts and humanities has basically a role to play, which is self-serving of me, but that's what I chose to do, and I've done it now. The crucial thing is that lore here isn't simply the reward for finishing a puzzle. It is the puzzle. And I'll give you a very basic example of how we try and make sure that the text, the stuff that is written, incorporates puzzle design into its nature. So for example, there are a bunch of different characters contributing to these documents, and they each have different typing habits. By paying attention and learning tonal and linguistic quirks, players can tell who is writing each document. And this has the effect of, as they work on them, narrowing the search space for A, where a fragment might have come from, and B, what it might mean. And there are other techniques that I can use as a writer and designer to build this kind of challenge into basically just words. So repeated meta elements like email headers create natural complications, which establish a relationship between documents that players need to unpick and figure out what it really means. And rhetorical flourishes, particularly like repetition, become really useful because they create ambiguity about the place of any given set of characters. The thing I'm really desperately avoiding doing here is saying whether this is correct or not, but I will indicate that there are several instances of repetition in this text, and that's not an accident. But in order to kind of illustrate what I mean in a little bit more detail, I'm going to grab a line from a text that is not in the game, which is the Gettysburg Address, and I'll pull this line particularly. I'm pulling this simply to illustrate the repetition of the phrase "the people," which is rhetoric as old as time, gains a kind of gameplay purpose based on how we break it up into maybe 3 or 4 character chunks. Because in this instance, we're going to start finding a bunch more bits of the phrase "the people" than are statistically likely as you start to gather samples. But how long will it take players to figure out that it is a statistical anomaly? And how many "the peoples" are there supposed to be? Are there 3? Are there 4? Are there 2? And it's only when they find something precious, like a bit of surrounding context, the back T from government or the Y from buy, that they might get the context they need to start actually figuring out what's happened. And then there are other sort of interpretive things they can do, like apply what they know about the writer. If they know that the writer is somebody who writes in this way and is fond of like fancy rhetoric, then they know that they can maybe safely assume that they've arrived at the right solution. To stress, we don't necessarily expect every player to think about it in these precise terms, but this is planned ambiguity that kind of is encouraged to create debate and create space, particularly for interesting mistakes, which are the best kind of mistakes. The other great thing about a system like this, just to go back to this, is it loves fresh perspectives. It really loves new players, ideally. And that's because a brand new player may not know enough about the game or about coding or anything else in order to build the perfect system that solves everything first time. But they can help with this interpretive process where there's still a lot of ambiguity. They can offer a fresh perspective on something that a veteran player may read with a whole set of biases. And it also does something that I wish kind of more games did, which was complicate being a veteran. Usually once you've got the most experience of a game, you are simply ahead of the game. And I think that is true at Hackmud in a lot of ways. But in this sense, it gets a little more complicated. If you have a lot of influence in the community and you really believe in a particular interpretation of what's going on in the story, then you'll probably transmit that interpretation to other people. They'll believe you maybe over their own intuition, and that can cause complications when it comes to getting to the answers you actually need to progress. And similarly, when players build museums, they codify their interpretations of what's going on. They set it down in stone for other people to read. And that's super interesting because if they codify a mistake, and I'm not going to say they have, but they have, then how much does it take? And this is a puzzle we don't have to design. What does it then take for somebody to notice that and actually push the consensus in a different direction to go to what is now become basically like text and say, I don't think that's quite right. So in broad terms, that's how we've tried to turn the process of discovering and understanding the lore of the game into a puzzle that players come together to work on. And it also acts as a final link between the top level of the game that I started talking about and that bottom level that exists in my Google Docs, the rules, basically. So that's the structure, basically. And you can map a few different things onto this structure. And I think it's an interesting way of thinking about narrative design. Generally, you could talk about the ideal tone of each level of the game. That's actually pretty accurate. Like, I'm trying to avoid, obviously, spoilers, and this may even come out to spoilers, I don't know. But tone is an interesting one. MMOs thrive on having like a pretty breezy tone at the top and pretty serious at the bottom. Like an armadillo, no. Just that allows most players day-to-day to enjoy jokes and fun stuff, and then people who really dig into it to find something a little bit more gritty or with a bit more sort of sci-fi heft, in this case a bit more of a hard SF heft, and that's, Destiny's, again, World of Warcraft, perfect examples of this. This also maps cleanly onto the number of people and the type of people who experience and appreciate each level. But this is to the point, which is that a system like this inevitably only appeals to a subset of players, and that's okay. But what we've been spending the intervening time working on, to varying degrees of success, is taking something that would be happening anyway, which is exploration of the underlying mystery by a community within the community, and trying to formally establish it as a play style, essentially to try and take archaeologist from a hobby that someone might take on within the game and turn it into a job, like a fun job, but one that pays people, basically. And this has influenced the way that puzzles are designed, particularly in the toughest ones that we've built, which are these big narrative events that happen every so often, and as I say, kind of amount to raids, moments when the community comes together to try and crack something. And I always try and make sure that we include different kinds of challenge in these events, but there's usually something that works a little bit like this. What's the next slide, Chris? It's this. Don't worry about that, it's just very orange. Players encounter a roadblock of some kind. And this roadblock requires a pretty short leap of logic if someone in the community understands something pretty fundamental about the backstory. And this might be information that's quite hard to infer, but it will reward very good guesses. Players with that understanding will suddenly become very valuable to the community because they're basically just really ahead of the game when it comes to understanding. However, Hackmud is a game about hacking, and our players are very good about brute forcing locks and reverse engineering solutions with only a few unrelated clues. It's very possible that they'll surmount any roadblock we put in front of them without actually having to understand the lore or the logic that underpins it. And that's okay too, and here's why, because it happened recently. Players encountered, as part of a puzzle, a bit of a custom encryption, basically, that looks like this. They needed to figure out what this meant, and they knew from an earlier stage in the puzzle that the key to this encryption was very likely to be an epoch timestamp, which for our purposes is a 10-digit number that marks a number of seconds since January the 1st, 1970. If their knowledge of what was going on in the story, based on previous clues and things they could have discovered, was sufficiently advanced, they would, with a bit of work, be able to locate that number pretty quickly. In the actual event, that's kind of not what happened. Someone managed to brute force the encryption to something that looked about right, faster than someone else was able to arrive at the lore solution through the storytelling route. But this is actually kind of cool as well, because what it means is that in applying a aggressive brute force solution to a puzzle, they end up getting through it to the next step, but another puzzle drops out. They have to try and figure out why it was significant that it was this number in the first case. What should be an answer becomes a clue, which is kind of an efficient way of feeding them back into the story. So in that sense, the system does work. Both approaches to play are viable, and players make sure they know that there's stuff they don't know yet, and the community learns that there is stuff to discover. On the other hand, when they move past this roadblock, and as a result, find out the information they need to get to the next thing, going back and sort of figuring out the whys and the context to understand the answers they've got becomes less urgent. And there probably are still players mulling over these sorts of questions, but there's nothing stopping them from moving on to any number of other activities, and they do. And that's fine. Obviously, they're playing the game, we're happy. But the question remains, how do we get archaeologists particularly to manifest as a playstyle? And that leads us on to what comes next for the game. So in the aftermath of our last narrative event, one of Hackmud's various fractious AI has begun to involve itself directly in this discovery process. And this AI, and the Hackmud community is learning about this for the first time now, is introducing a new kind of lock into the game's ecosystem. Locks are essentially puzzles that you bolt onto an account in order to protect it. This could be bolted to an NPC account, therefore barring you from money, basically, or onto your own to protect your own upgrades and cash. So they are fundamental to how basically hacking, stealing stuff works in the game. These new locks, which will be arriving soon, task players with assembling or determining a multi-part long-form password, which is constructed out of what amounts to those sort of password reminder clues you set when you sign up for almost anything. At the lowest difficulty, the answers these require and the data set they pulls from stuff that most players will have encountered, or hopefully every player will have encountered, or at least stuff that they can easily find. That's the easiest level where new players come into the game. As the tier of the lock increases, they start to pull from kind of rarer and rarer forms of information. And at the very highest level of difficulty, with the right mods, these locks are capable of pulling questions, essentially, or just sort of absences from parts of the game that we haven't explored yet at all. And this will be the player's first experience of some of those. What this means in game terms is that functionally, some of the most valuable accounts in the game, whether player-owned or NPCs, essentially, can be rendered temporarily uncrackable because the community as a whole doesn't understand something yet. What we hope and anticipate that this will do is turn those answers into commodities in their own right. If you're a player who seeks those answers, you can either invest the time at the moment you encounter them into trying to crack the lock and find the truth, or you can go find an archaeologist who's been working on this stuff for ages. That archaeologist then has the freedom to set their own price for that information. We hope to find situations where these answers become property, essentially corporate secrets that are jealously guarded and ultimately stolen and so on. It's all hacking at the end of the day. So the introduction of a new lock like this has pretty major implications for the game's daily status quo. And so I hope the community is glad that we're giving them a bit of a heads up about it. It's not a very big heads up, however, because Sean, who's watching from America, it's live now. So have fun with that, gang. And thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about what we've been working on. And if you'd like to find out more about Hackmud, you can find us on Steam or at hackmud.com. And I think we have time for some questions, or do we not, Jonty? Good. If anyone has any questions, please put your hand up and we'll figure that out.
Anyone? Oh, okay.
Hello.
Hey there. Has anyone sort of hacked into the actual game files to find any answers to any of the puzzles? And do you like the fact that they've done it if they have?
So, not to my knowledge, not since I've been working on the game. And obviously, like we have a code of conduct for players in terms of all sorts of different behavior, and breaking the game for other players in whatever way outside the context of the game is something that we don't necessarily, or don't encourage and actively prohibit. In this case of story stuff, I can't answer definitively if that's happened in other contexts. In the case of story stuff, it hasn't happened. And to answer the other part of your question, obviously the question is where the game ends. I would not treat that as necessarily like the ideal experience, and I think neither would the players, actually. Like, I imagine there might be players who have refused to watch any of this because the sort of presence of meta information is something that people don't really enjoy. I'll give you an example. Like, if a character in the game happens to type in British English, someone might go, "Is this just Chris making a mistake?" And I'm going to leave that one ambiguous, but no, that character is British. And but nonetheless, that's an area. If someone then comes in and says like, "Oh, maybe we can kind of metagame this. We can kind of try and figure out what the answer is based on something we know about the making of the game," people tend to go like, "No, let's try and actually solve things within the context of the mystery as it's received." Long story short, please don't hack me. Any other questions? Anybody? Yeah.
So, do you write the clues first, or do you find the gameplay mechanics and the way that people are going to hack them first?
So it's as in when we're talking about puzzle design specifically.
Yeah, so like puzzle design as opposed to.
So it's like anything. It's kind of iterative, and sort of nested in some ways. So they'll have an overall concept for what we want the puzzle to be, and that arrives from two different sides at once. So I'll give you an example. The most recent one I conceptualized as basically like a multi-wing dungeon from the beginning. And I won't get into the details of what that means in the context of a computer file, but it was essentially a script where the players could, once they uncovered the right method, which included that encryption I described earlier, sort of, and I'm careful with what they say, if the live stream's still on, they'll probably misinterpret some things here, but essentially wind the script forward, backwards in time through versioning in order to encounter different things from different angles. And that then is basically like, oh, that's a fun idea, that's a fun puzzle idea, but it's also got obvious storytelling potential. And so there's a mix of like, I know what story I want to tell, and I know what kind of dungeon I want to build, basically. So it's where you find the points of congruence. But what I won't do is ever break that fundamental logic that I wrote right at the start of this process. Because I think at that point, that's where you risk, and I don't mean to throw shade on Lost specifically, plenty of mystery shows make this mistake, but the point where you've kind of backed yourself into a corner and you don't have a way of plotting your way back out of it within the logic that you've established. So you have to kind of betray the audience's trust a little bit. That's what I'm desperately trying to avoid. And I'm happy so far that we have. Like we're aware when players ask questions, like this doesn't make any sense. And at least as far as I've seen it, every time they've gone, oh, this seems weird, it's because they don't get something about the system yet, rather than I have effed up. Which is not to say that doesn't happen, because it does. But fingers crossed. Yeah. Any other questions? It's a big old no from you guys. Okay, well in that case, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.